June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, 110 miles west of the Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu, piloting his Mitsubishi A6M5 Zero fighter off the carrier Zuikaku, saw the impossible. American Hellcat fighters, dozens of them, diving through his formation at 20,000 feet before his strike wave could even reach the U.S. fleet. His commanders had promised numerical advantage. They said Japanese skill would overcome American power. But his wingman exploded in a fireball after just seconds of contact. No warning, no chance. The Americans weren't defending, they were hunting. How did enemy fighters appear where they shouldn't be? How were American pilots finding his formation 100 miles from their carriers? In the next 48 hours, Japan's carrier aviation would be annihilated in the most one-sided air battle in history. And Tanimizu would understand why the mathematics of this war had already been decided. The morning of June 19, 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of Japan's combined fleet, had staked everything on a single declaration: the fate of the empire rests on this one battle. Operation A-Go, Japan's plan to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one decisive carrier engagement, represented the last realistic chance to halt the American island-hopping campaign that now threatened Japan's inner defense perimeter. The U.S. invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands had begun 4 days earlier on June 15, and if successful would place American B-29s within striking range of the Japanese home islands. Japan's mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa, sorted with carriers, battleships, and cruisers, the entire operational strength of Japanese naval aviation, to intercept and annihilate the American invasion force. Facing them was a naval armada of unprecedented scale. American Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher under the overall direction of Admiral Raymond Spruance and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, deployed 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. These carriers embarked between 900 and 1,300 operational aircraft, the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled. The American fleet had 2 missions: protect the Saipan invasion force from Japanese counterattack and destroy Japan's carrier capability if the opportunity presented itself. Mitscher's carriers had been positioned west of Saipan, directly in the path of any Japanese naval approach. The strategic mathematics were brutal. Japan no longer possessed the industrial capacity or trained pilot reserves to sustain a war of attrition. Every carrier, every aircraft, every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. The training pipeline that once produced elite naval aviators had collapsed under the pressure of mounting losses throughout 1943 and early 1944. Operation A-Go wasn't just another naval battle, it was Japan's last gamble with its remaining carrier air power. If the mobile fleet failed to break American naval dominance in the Philippine Sea, Japan would be reduced to defensive operations with dwindling resources and no offensive capability. The Japanese plan relied on several assumptions: that their aircraft's longer range would allow them to strike American carriers first while remaining out of range of counterstrikes, that their pilots' skill and determination would overcome material disadvantages, and that they could coordinate strikes from both carrier-based aircraft and land-based aircraft from nearby islands to achieve overwhelming force against the American fleet. What Japanese commanders didn't know was that American technological advantages, radar, fighter direction systems, superior fuel, better trained pilots, and rugged aircraft had already made these assumptions obsolete. Early morning on June 19, American radar operators began detecting the first Japanese strike formations. At ranges exceeding 110 miles, far beyond visual distance, U.S. ships tracked incoming enemy aircraft as glowing blips on radar screens. Fighter direction centers aboard American carriers immediately began vectoring Hellcat interceptors toward calculated intercept points, guiding them via radio communication to meet Japanese formations long before they could threaten the fleet. The Japanese pilots, relying on visual coordination and flying without comparable radar warning systems, had no idea they were being tracked from the moment they launched. The largest carrier air battle in history was about to begin, but it wouldn't be the decisive engagement Japan envisioned. The gap in technology, training, fuel quality, industrial capacity, and tactical coordination had grown so wide that what Japanese commanders believed would be a battle would instead become a massacre. The Americans had multiple overlapping advantages the Japanese didn't know existed, and even if they had known, they lacked the resources to counter them. As the first American Hellcats accelerated toward their intercept points at 375 miles per hour, and Japanese Zeros cruised toward what they believed would be a surprise attack, the question wasn't whether Japan would win. The question was whether Japan's carrier aviation would survive the next 48 hours at all. The answer would shock both sides, but for very different reasons. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had been designed with one singular purpose: kill Japanese Zeros. When Grumman engineers began work on the Hellcat in 1941, they studied every combat report from the Pacific, analyzed every advantage the Mitsubishi A6M Zero held over early American fighters, and built an aircraft specifically to dominate it. The result was a machine that represented American industrial philosophy applied to aerial combat: rugged, powerful, and overwhelmingly lethal. The F6, F3, and F6F5 variants flying from American carriers on June 19, 1944 could reach 375 to 388 miles per hour in level flight, powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R 2,800 double wasp radial engine that gave pilots speed and climb rate Japanese aircraft couldn't match. Armament told the Hellcat's story of American firepower doctrine. 6 AN M2.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, delivered approximately 4,800 rounds per minute combined, 80 bullets per second of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition that could shred enemy aircraft in 2-second bursts. Each gun carried 400 rounds, giving pilots enough ammunition for sustained combat. The .50 caliber projectiles traveling at 2,900 feet per second generated kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate engine blocks, sever control cables, and ignite fuel tanks from ranges exceeding 1,000 feet. But the Hellcat's true advantage wasn't just firepower, it was survivability. Self-sealing fuel tanks that closed automatically when punctured, armor plating protecting the pilot and critical systems, and robust construction that could absorb battle damage and return pilots home made the Hellcat forgiving in combat. American designers had learned the lesson: dead pilots couldn't pass on experience. Bring them home, and they'd become aces. Standing in stark contrast was the Mitsubishi A6M5 Zero, the refined variant of Japan's legendary carrier fighter. The Zero had terrorized Allied forces in 1941 and 1942 with unmatched agility, exceptional range, and skilled pilots who exploited its maneuverability to deadly effect. But by June 1944, the Zero's design philosophy, prioritizing range and agility over protection and firepower, had become a fatal liability. The A6M5 could reach approximately 350 miles per hour in level flight, powered by a 1,130 horsepower Nakajima Sakai radial engine, notably slower than the Hellcat. Its armament consisted of two 20mm Type 99 cannons with 100 rounds each and two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns with 680 rounds each, lighter firepower that required precision to be effective. The Zero's critical flaw was protection, or rather the complete lack of it. No armor plating shielded the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. The airframe, constructed of lightweight aluminum alloy for maximum range and maneuverability, offered no redundancy. A single .50 caliber hit to the fuel tank or engine could ignite an inferno that consumed the aircraft in seconds. Japanese design philosophy assumed pilots would avoid being hit through superior skill and agility. American philosophy assumed pilots would be hit and built aircraft that could survive. In June 1944, one direct burst from a Hellcat 6.50 caliber guns into a Zero typically resulted in catastrophic structural failure, fire, or explosion. But a Zero pilot needed sustained, accurate fire with lighter weapons to down a Hellcat, and had to survive long enough to deliver it. The production numbers revealed the industrial chasm between the two nations. Grumman manufactured 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, with production peaking at over 500 aircraft per month in 1944. American factories operated around the clock with nearly unlimited raw materials, fuel, and skilled labor. Replacement aircraft flowed to carriers faster than combat could consume them. Japan, by contrast, faced collapsing production capacity, resource shortages, and bombing campaigns that disrupted manufacturing. While Japan produced capable fighters throughout the war, total military aircraft production for all types, fighters, bombers, trainers, reconnaissance, reached approximately 76,000 aircraft for the entire war versus America's 300,000 plus. Every Japanese aircraft lost represented irreplaceable national treasure. Every American aircraft lost was another serial number to be replaced within weeks. But specifications told only part of the story. The Hellcat had been designed for the realities of carrier warfare in ways the Zero never was. Its wide track landing gear provided stability on carrier decks in rough seas. Its cockpit layout and controls were standardized, allowing replacement pilots to transition quickly. Its radial engine, while less elegant than inline designs, could sustain catastrophic damage. Entire cylinders shot away and continue running long enough to reach friendly territory. The Zero, optimized for range and weight, demanded precision in every aspect of operation. Minor battle damage could render it unflyable. Rough carrier landings could collapse landing gear. And critically, the Zero's lightweight structure couldn't be retrofitted with armor or self-sealing tanks without destroying its performance characteristics. When Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu's wingman exploded in that opening engagement on June 19, the fireball wasn't bad luck, it was engineering destiny. The Hellcat pilot's 6.50 caliber guns had delivered approximately 160 rounds in a 2-second burst, their armor-piercing incendiary projectiles punching through the Zero's unprotected fuel tank and igniting 156 gallons of aviation gasoline in an instantaneous conflagration. The American pilot survived the return fire because his self-sealing tanks closed punctures within seconds and his armor absorbed the 7.7mm rounds. This wasn't combat. It was a materials science experiment with lethal conclusions. The Americans had built an aircraft that embodied a simple principle: bring your pilots home alive, and they'll kill more enemy tomorrow. The Japanese had built an aircraft that assumed pilots were expendable if it extended range and agility. On June 19, 1944, in the skies over the Philippine Sea, those two philosophies collided with mathematical brutality. American radar operators had been tracking Japanese strike formations since they launched from their carriers. At 0830 hours on June 19, when the first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft departed from Vice Admiral Ozawa's carriers approximately 200 miles west of Task Force 58, American radar screens lit up with contacts at ranges exceeding 110 miles, far beyond visual distance. Far beyond anything Japanese pilots could detect. Fighter. Direction centers aboard carriers like USS Lexington immediately began the coordinated dance of modern naval warfare, calculating intercept vectors, assigning Hellcat squadrons, vectoring fighters via radio to meet enemy formations at predetermined points in empty sky. The Japanese pilots, relying on visual coordination and hand signals within formations, had no idea they were being hunted from the moment they became airborne. This was the revolution. American engineers and tacticians had perfected radar-directed fighter interception, while Japanese carriers relied on scouts and visual searches to locate enemy forces. American ships used rotating antenna arrays to paint a complete picture of the battle space in 3 dimensions. When Japanese strike coordinators believed they were approaching undetected for a surprise attack, American fighter direction officers were counting aircraft, estimating altitude, predicting course, and dispatching interceptors with mathematical precision. It wasn't combat experience or pilot skill alone that gave Americans this advantage. It was technology the Japanese Navy couldn't match, and tactics they had no doctrine to counter. Sanchez. The fuel quality gap compounded Japanese disadvantages in ways that weren't visible but were absolutely decisive. American Hellcat engines burned 130 octane aviation gasoline, among the highest quality fuel produced during World War II. This high-octane fuel allowed Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines to generate their rated 2,000 horsepower without detonation or engine damage. Moreover, Hellcats were equipped with water injection systems that, when activated for war emergency power, could boost output beyond rated specifications for short periods, giving American pilots extra speed and climb rate in critical moments when survival demanded maximum performance. The fuel's energy density and anti-knock properties meant American engines operated at peak efficiency throughout entire missions. Japanese aircraft in June 1944 burned fuel averaging 87 to 91 octane, and sometimes lower-grade fuel mixed with additives and substitutes due to American submarine blockades strangling Japan's petroleum supply lines. This wasn't a minor disadvantage, it was catastrophic for combat performance. Lower octane ratings meant engines couldn't be pushed to maximum power settings without risking pre-detonation that could destroy cylinders and seize engines mid-flight. Japanese pilots couldn't sustain high-power combat maneuvers without literally destroying their aircraft from within. They flew with power settings reduced below design specifications, robbing them of speed and climb rate at the moments when combat demanded maximum performance. When American and Japanese fighters engaged, Hellcat pilots could firewall throttles and activate war emergency power, knowing their fuel would support it. Zero pilots had to carefully manage power to prevent engine failure in a dogfight where split-second decisions determined survival. The training disparity was equally brutal. American carrier pilots arriving at Task Force 58 in June 1944 had completed approximately 525 hours of flight training before their first combat mission. This included primary training, advanced tactical instruction, carrier qualification with multiple arrested landings, instrument flying, night operations, formation flying, gunnery practice firing thousands of live rounds, and often specialized courses in fighter tactics. Many pilots had combat experience from earlier campaigns, having rotated back for rest and reassignment, with invaluable lessons learned. The U.S. Navy's training pipeline treated pilots as assets to be developed thoroughly before commitment to combat, understanding that inexperienced pilots died quickly and took expensive aircraft with them. Japanese pilots in June 1944 faced a collapsed training system that reflected their nation's desperation. New aviators received between 275 and 300 hours of flight training if they were fortunate, and sometimes as little as 100 hours for replacement pilots rushed to fill gaps left by mounting casualties. Japan's veteran pilots, the elite aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor, dominated the early Pacific campaigns and accumulated thousands of combat hours, were dead. They had been killed in the grinding attrition of 1943 and early 1944 at places like Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and Truk. Their replacements were students, many still learning basic formation, flying, and gunnery, with minimal or no combat experience. Japan's training infrastructure couldn't produce pilots fast enough to replace losses, couldn't provide adequate fuel for training flights, and couldn't spare experienced instructors because they were needed at the front. The consequence was mathematical. When American fighter pilots with 525+ hours of training and possible combat experience engaged Japanese pilots with fewer than 300 hours and no combat experience, the outcome wasn't determined by courage or determination, it was determined by muscle memory, situational awareness, and reflexes developed through hundreds of practice hours. American pilots could track multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously, coordinate attacks via radio, execute complex tactical maneuvers instinctively, and maintain formation discipline under fire. Japanese pilots struggled with basic tasks, became disoriented in chaotic combat, and often broke formation at first contact, making themselves easy targets for coordinated American attacks. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey, fighter director aboard USS Lexington, vectored Hellcat squadrons toward Japanese formations with clinical efficiency throughout June 19. His radar showed him exactly where enemy aircraft were, what altitude they flew, and where they would be in 5 minutes. He spoke calmly over radio circuits, Vector 270, Angels 20, bogies at 40 miles. The Hellcat pilots received precise instructions that put them in perfect intercept position. The Japanese strike leaders had no such information, no such coordination, and no warning that 60 American fighters were diving on their formation until they saw tracer fire and aircraft exploding around them. This was the invisible advantage that broke Japanese naval aviation. Not just better aircraft or more firepower, but layered technological and tactical superiority, radar seeing over the horizon, fuel enabling maximum performance, training creating instinctive competence, and industrial capacity making losses irrelevant. The Japanese entered the Battle of the Philippine Sea believing carrier skill and determination could overcome material disadvantages. They didn't know the material disadvantages had grown so large that skill became irrelevant. As the first Hellcat interceptors reached their assigned points and spotted the incoming Japanese formations at 0930 hours on June 19, the turkey shoot was seconds from beginning. And the Japanese pilots flying into American guns had no idea they were already dead. The slaughter began at 10:36 hours. Hellcat fighters from VF-16 off USS Lexington intercepted the first Japanese wave of 69 aircraft approximately 60 miles from Task Force 58. Commander Charles Brewer led his squadron into a coordinated dive attack that shredded the Japanese formation within minutes. Zero fighters, already struggling to maintain cohesion, broke apart under the assault. American pilots fired short, precise bursts from their 6.50 caliber guns, 2 seconds of fire per pass, conserving ammunition while delivering lethal effect. Japanese aircraft exploded, tumbled out of control, or simply disintegrated as high-velocity rounds severed wings and ignited unprotected fuel tanks. The first wave lost 42 of 69 aircraft, before a single Japanese pilot reached visual range of the American fleet. Those that penetrated the fighter screen encountered a second nightmare, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire using VT proximity-fused shells that detonated when near aircraft carpeting the sky with shrapnel. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying an F6F3 Hellcat with VF-16 from Lexington, was vectored toward a formation of Japanese dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. What followed became legend. In 8 minutes of combat, Vrasiu shot down 6 enemy aircraft, 4 Yokosuka D-4 Wide Judy dive bombers and 2 escort fighters, firing controlled bursts and maneuvering with precision that reflected his 525 hours of training and previous combat experience. After landing aboard Lexington, Vrasiu held up 6 fingers to signal his kills to the deck crew. A photographer captured the moment, a grinning pilot, completely unscathed, who had just annihilated 6 enemy aircraft without sustaining a single hit. This wasn't exceptional skill, it was the result of superior aircraft, superior training, superior fuel, and superior coordination against an enemy that had none of those advantages. The second Japanese wave of 109 aircraft launched between 0900 and 1000 hours, unaware that the first wave had been virtually annihilated. American radar detected them at over 100 miles distance. Task Force 58 scrambled additional Hellcat squadrons, vectoring them to intercept points calculated by fighter directors using radar plots and altitude estimates. The result was identical. Coordinated American attacks tore apart Japanese formations long before they could threaten carriers. 70 Japanese aircraft were shot down before reaching the fleet. Another 27 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire or crashed attempting to attack through the defensive screen. Fewer than a dozen aircraft from the second wave survived to return to their carriers, most damaged beyond repair. During a debriefing after the first two air battles, a pilot from USS Lexington remarked with genuine amazement at the one-sided nature of the combat, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The name stuck. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, HUC, slaughter so complete that American pilots struggled to comprehend the totality of their dominance. The kill ratio was approaching 20-1, 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American fighter lost. This wasn't the result of Japanese cowardice or incompetence. It was the mathematical conclusion of every accumulated American advantage expressed simultaneously in combat. The third Japanese wave of 47 aircraft launched around noon, tasked with attacking American carriers despite radio reports of catastrophic losses from the first two waves. Japanese commanders, unable to believe the scale of disaster, continued sending aircraft into the meat grinder. American fighters intercepted the third wave and destroyed 40 aircraft in minutes. 7 Japanese planes managed to attack American ships. All 7 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire without scoring significant hits. Not a single aircraft from the third wave returned to its carrier. The fourth and final Japanese strike wave launched between 10:30 and 11:30 hours with 82 aircraft, the last reserves of Operation A-Go. These pilots never located Task Force 58. Disoriented and running low on fuel, many diverted toward Guam to refuel at Orote Field. American fighter patrols over Guam intercepted 49 Japanese aircraft attempting to land. 30 were shot down in running dogfights. The remainder were so badly damaged they couldn't fly again. Other aircraft from the fourth wave stumbled upon American ships and were destroyed piecemeal by coordinated fighter attacks. By 1500 hours on June 19, just 6.5 hours after the first contact, Japanese carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an offensive force. Of approximately 430 aircraft launched in 4 strike waves throughout the day, at least 315 carrier-based aircraft were destroyed, along with an additional 50 land-based aircraft from Guam. American losses in air combat, 29 aircraft. The kill ratio exceeded 20-1, and in some individual squadron actions approached 30-1. The disparity wasn't marginal, it was absolute, a demonstration that modern industrial warfare had reached a point where technological, material, and training superiority made traditional notions of combat skill irrelevant. Japanese pilots kept coming throughout June 19, not because they were stupid or suicidal, but because duty and orders demanded it. They flew into combat knowing they were outmatched, knowing their aircraft were inferior, knowing their training was inadequate, and knowing their chances of survival were minimal. They came anyway because Imperial Japan demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was all they had left to give. The Americans killed them with industrial efficiency, not out of cruelty, but because every system, every advantage, every technological edge, and every gallon of high-octane fuel had been designed and produced for exactly this purpose: total annihilation of enemy air power. As the sun set on June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Ozawa assessed his losses and confronted a devastating reality. His carrier air groups, launched with over 400 aircraft that morning, now possessed approximately 100 operational aircraft, a 75% loss rate in a single day. He had been defeated not by American skill alone, but by American industrial civilization expressing its full power through technology, training, logistics, and overwhelming material advantage. The turkey shoot wasn't sport, it was mathematics. While Japanese aircraft were being slaughtered throughout June 19, American submarines delivered their own devastating blows to Ozawa's mobile fleet. At 0809 hours, U.S. Albacore SS-218 achieved firing position on the Japanese fleet carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship and newest carrier, completed just 3 months earlier. A single torpedo struck Taiho amidships, rupturing aviation fuel storage tanks. Initial damage appeared manageable, but volatile fuel vapors spread throughout the ship via ventilation systems damaged in the attack. At 1532 hours, a catastrophic explosion tore Taiho apart as fuel vapors ignited, killing 1,650 officers and crew. Vice Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to carrier Zuikaku, learning for the first time the full scale of his air losses as survivors reported to the new flagship. Hours later, at 12:20, USS Kavala SS-244 fired a spread of torpedoes at fleet carrier Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and countless Pacific battles. 3 torpedoes struck home, triggering uncontrollable fires that reached the aviation fuel stores and munitions magazines. At 15:01 hours, Shokaku exploded and sank, taking 1,272 men down with her. In a single day, Ozawa had lost 2 fleet carriers to submarines, 3/4 of his aircraft to American fighters, and any possibility of continuing offensive operations. The mobile fleet, crippled and bloodied, withdrew westward during the night of June 19 to June 20, attempting to escape total annihilation. American commanders faced a dilemma. Task Force 58 had achieved total defensive victory, destroying Japanese air power while sustaining minimal losses. But Ozawa's carriers remained afloat and retreating. Admiral Mitscher wanted to pursue and finish the destruction of Japan's carrier fleet, turning tactical victory into strategic annihilation. Throughout the night and into June 20, American search aircraft scoured the Philippine Sea for the retreating Japanese force. At 15:40 hours, on June 20, late afternoon with sunset, at approximately 1900 hours, scout planes finally located Ozawa's fleet, approximately 275 miles northwest of Task Force 58. Mitscher faced an agonizing decision. A strike launched immediately would reach the Japanese fleet near dusk, allowing perhaps 45 minutes of daylight combat. But returning aircraft would face night carrier recovery, a notoriously dangerous operation that most pilots hadn't trained for, attempting arrested landings on pitching carrier decks in darkness over open ocean. The alternative was to let the Japanese escape, wasting the opportunity to destroy their carriers. Mitscher made his choice, launched the strike. At 16:24 hours, 216 American aircraft, Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers departed Task Force 58 headed northwest toward the maximum range of their combat radius. They knew the return trip would test fuel capacity to its absolute limits. At approximately 18:40 hours, with the sun descending toward the horizon, American aircraft found Ozawa's fleeing carriers. In a brief, violent engagement, U.S. planes sank the light carrier Hyo, damaged fleet carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda, damaged battleship Haruna, and sank 2 fleet oilers. Only 20 American aircraft were lost to Japanese defensive fire. The Turkey shoot's lopsided kill ratio had followed the attackers even into this desperate long-range strike. But the mission's deadliest phase lay ahead. American aircraft began returning to Task Force 58 around 20:45 hours. Full darkness, fuel gauges reading near empty, pilots exhausted from combat and navigation, attempting to find carriers in an ocean of blacks. Aircraft began running out of fuel and ditching in the sea. Pilots radioed desperate fuel, status reports as engines sputtered and died. Lieutenant Junior Grade, William Luton, piloting an SB-2C Helldiver, wrote in his diary, "The ack-ack followed us for quite a while, and when it stopped, I thought my worries were over. In reality, our troubles were only beginning. Admiral Mitscher made a decision that risked his entire task force. Despite the danger of Japanese submarines targeting illuminated ships and the certainty of revealing Task Force 58's position to any enemy within 50 miles, he ordered all carriers to turn on flight deck lights, searchlights, and running lights, transforming the darkened fleet into a beacon for returning pilots. The risk of submarine attack was real. The risk of losing 100-plus aircraft and their trained air crews was certain without illumination. Mitscher chose his pilots over his ships. The night recovery was chaos. Exhausted pilots attempted landings on unfamiliar carriers, missing arresting wires and crashing into parked aircraft. Some misjudged altitude and flew into the ocean short of the flight deck. Others ran out of fuel on final approach and ditched alongside the carriers. Destroyers and cruisers maneuvered through the darkness, searchlights scanning the water for downed air crews. Approximately 80 aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion, crashes, and water landings during the recovery, nearly 4 times the combat losses from the actual strike. But destroyers and submarines rescued most downed pilots throughout the night and into June 21, bringing them back aboard carriers with little more than wet flight suits and extraordinary stories. The final accounting was staggering. During June 19–20, 1944, Japan lost approximately 476 to 600-plus aircraft, 315 carrier-based planes destroyed on June 19, additional aircraft destroyed during the June 20 strike, and land-based aircraft destroyed over Guam. 3 carriers were sunk: Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio. Several other carriers and warships suffered damage. American losses totaled approximately 123 to 130 aircraft, of which only 29 were lost to enemy action in combat. The rest were victims of fuel exhaustion during the night recovery. The disparity was absolute, the victory complete, the strategic implications irreversible. Vice Admiral Ozawa received orders during the night of June 20 to withdraw from the Philippine Sea. Time 0.5, his mobile fleet, intended to deliver a decisive blow to American naval power, had been annihilated without inflicting significant damage on Task Force 58. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, largest carrier engagement in history, was over. Japan's carrier aviation capability was dead. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive weapon forever. This wasn't temporary damage or recoverable losses. It was permanent strategic destruction. Vice Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet limped back to Japan with hollow carriers, skeletal air groups, and the knowledge that Operation Ago had failed catastrophically. Japan would never again launch a major carrier operation for the remainder of World War II. The mathematics were inescapable. Japan had lost approximately 600 aircraft and 3 carriers while inflicting trivial damage on American forces. But more devastating than aircraft losses were the pilots. Japanese naval aviation had entered the war in December 1941 with perhaps the most experienced and capable carrier pilots in the world, veterans with thousands of flight hours, extensive training, and tactical doctrine refined through years of combat in China. By June 1944, they were dead. Killed at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Rabaul, Truk, and 100 smaller engagements throughout 1942 and 1943. Their replacements, the pilots slaughtered over the Philippine Sea, had been students with 275 hours of training, rushed into combat against American veterans with 525-plus hours and superior aircraft. Japan couldn't replace experienced pilots. The training infrastructure had collapsed under fuel shortages, instructor shortages, and time pressure. Aircraft could theoretically be built, although resource blockades strangled production. But pilots, competent, experienced aviators who could survive modern combat, required years to develop, and Japan didn't have years. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific. American forces captured Saipan by July 9, 1944, providing airfield bases within B-29 superfortress range of the Japanese home islands. Subsequent invasions of Tinian and Guam completed American control of the Marianas, establishing forward bases that would serve as launch points for the strategic bombing campaign that would incinerate Japanese cities throughout 1945. Japan, having lost its carrier air capability at Philippine Sea, couldn't interfere with these operations. American carriers roamed the Western Pacific virtually unopposed, striking targets throughout the Philippines, Taiwan, and eventually the Japanese home islands themselves. The industrial truth revealed at Philippine Sea was brutal and irrefutable. American production capacity, 300,000-plus military aircraft of all types during the war versus Japan's 76,000, meant the United States could sustain any loss rate and continue fighting. Task Force 58 lost 130 aircraft at Philippine Sea, mostly to fuel exhaustion rather than combat. Within 3 weeks, all losses were replaced with new aircraft delivered from stateside factories. Pilots who had been rescued from water landings were back in cockpits within days, having lost nothing but wet flight suits. American casualties from the battle totaled approximately 76 personnel killed or missing. Tragic for those individuals and their families, but strategically insignificant to a nation mobilized for industrial war. Japan's losses were irreplaceable. The approximately 445 aircrew killed at Philippine Sea, pilots, gunners, bombardiers, observers, represented institutional knowledge, training investment, and combat capability that could never be recovered. The 3 carriers sunk, took years to build, and couldn't be replaced with Japan's shipbuilding capacity strained and resources depleted. The war's outcome had been determined long before Philippine Sea, determined in American factories, oil refineries, training schools, and design bureaus. But Philippine Sea was where the mathematical certainty became undeniable reality. By late 1944 and into 1945, Japan resorted to kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks by aircraft deliberately crashed into American ships. This wasn't a tactical innovation or cultural preference, it was an admission of defeat. Japan no longer possessed pilots skilled enough to conduct conventional attacks and return home, aircraft capable of penetrating American defenses, or fuel sufficient for sustained operations. Kamikaze represented the final degradation of Japanese naval aviation, one-way missions by barely trained pilots in obsolete aircraft expending irreplaceable resources for marginal tactical effect. The gap between American and Japanese capability, already vast at Philippine Sea, had grown into an unbridgeable chasm. The F6F Hellcat finished World War II with an overall kill ratio of 19-1, 19 enemy aircraft, destroyed for every Hellcat lost in combat. Of the 12,275 Hellcats built, they were credited with destroying approximately 5,223 enemy aircraft while suffering 270 combat losses. The Philippine Sea engagement, with its 20-1 kill ratio, was typical of Hellcat performance when supported by adequate fuel, trained pilots, radar coordination, and industrial backup. The aircraft wasn't just superior, it was optimized for every dimension of modern carrier warfare in ways that Japanese aircraft, designed under different assumptions with different resources, could never match. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot nickname endures as historical shorthand for one-sided victory, a battle so dominated by one side that combat became slaughter. But the nickname obscures the deeper lesson. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that modern industrial warfare had reached a point where material, technological, and training advantages could become so overwhelming that traditional military virtues, courage, skill, determination became irrelevant. The Japanese pilots who flew into American guns on June 19, 1944, weren't cowards or incompetents. They were professionals doing their duty with inadequate tools against an enemy that had mobilized every advantage industrial civilization could provide. Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu, who saw the impossible on that June morning, American Hellcats appearing in his formation before his strike wave could even sight the enemy fleet, survived the battle and would eventually understand what had killed his wingman and destroyed Japanese naval aviation. It wasn't bad luck or tactical mistakes. It was radar that tracked him from launch, fuel that gave American fighters maximum power, training that made American pilots instinctively lethal, aircraft designed to bring American pilots home alive, and industrial capacity that made American losses meaningless. Those radar contacts at 0830 hours on June 19, 1944 weren't an incoming threat to the American fleet. They were Japan's carrier aviation flying to its own funeral, and everyone on both sides would eventually realize it was a funeral that had been scheduled years earlier in American shipyards, aircraft factories, and training schools. The age of Japanese naval air dominance died in the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. It would never return.